welcome back to Epochs. If you remember last time, we'd finished with the Siege of Harfleur, Henry V's famous 1415 campaign. So in this episode, hopefully I'm going to try and get us up to the Battle of Agincourt, or at least the night before the Battle of Agincourt. And so that's about a whole month. And there is a fair amount of detail to go through. I hope you like it. So I shall be continuing with Ian Mortimer's great book, 1415, Henry V's Year of Glory, which does go into far more detail than I've seen in any other book. So let's just continue with this. Ian Mortimer starts us off with cutting back to the French side of the equation. He says, quote, John the Fearless had been at Argilly for over a month now. 4 days ago, on the 20th, the ambassadors of the French government, led by the Duke of Lorraine, had arrived. Their mission was to try to persuade John to send men to help the Dauphin in his struggle against the English and, at the same time, to keep John away from Paris, because the French side were worried that John the Fearless might attempt a coup, or another coup. If you remember from earlier episodes, there'd been all sorts of internal civil strife, civil war in France between the Armagnac faction and the Burgundian faction. So the powers that be, the actual royal family and the Dauphin and the king, were suspicious and wary of John the Fearless, to say the least. They didn't necessarily really want him in command of an army. But still, they also needed him at the same time, so caught between a bit of a rock and a hard place. Mortimer continues saying, with Paris in a heightened state of anxiety and experiencing a particular cynicism with regard to the government, the appearance of John the Fearless in the city threatened to cause mayhem, if not an insurrection. And by today, we're talking about Tuesday, the 24th of September. Today, the ambassadors were given 3 letters, one of which had been written by John the Fearless himself. Of course, the Duke revelled in the chance to cause more upset in Paris, and saw the slight to himself in the earlier letters as being the perfect excuse to push the Dauphin into a corner. John professed his deepest loyalty to the Kingdom of France, but complained bitterly about the request that he remain at home and not come to the rescue of France in her hour of need. Was he not the Dauphin's father-in-law? Why had all the other lords of northern France been summoned and he had not? It was nothing more than an attempt to belittle him and to undermine his honour, which he valued higher than anything else in the world. Instead of the paltry 500 men-at-arms he had been asked to send, he would attend in person with a far larger number, as it was his duty to save the kingdom in its current peril. Another of the letters that went back with the Duke of Lorraine was written by vassals of John the Fearless on behalf of their lord. They complained that John had not been given command of his own men. This was most unfitting. The men of Burgundy saw their prime loyalty being to the Duke of Burgundy and not to the King of France. The lords also supported the tenor of the Duke's own letter. How come the Dauphin required so few troops? Why had there been such a delay in requesting them from the Duke of Burgundy? Why had the Duke himself been asked not to fight for the kingdom? Had not the seriousness of the English threat been registered by the government? For the envoys who had to carry these letters back to the Dauphin, the menace of John the Fearless must have seemed as dangerous as that of Henry V, and although the Duke's own letter seemed to suggest he was wholeheartedly on the side of the French, they could not be sure he would not switch at the last moment and side with the English. They could not be certain that he would not simply take his soldiers and ride into Paris, betraying both the King of France and the King of England. The only thing they could be certain of was that no one could trust him. As it happened, John the Fearless had already started to gather his forces together. He might have spent 4 days arguing against the king's order on the 1st of September to send more troops, but in fact he had issued orders to his marshals on the 15th of September to start gathering the men required. End quote. So it's not completely crazy for the Armagnac faction in France to fear that John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, might suddenly switch sides and just side with Harry of England, because he had had deals with the English before to side with them against the crown of France. So it's not really all that crazy or paranoid to think that could happen. But as it turns out, John the Fearless, spoiler alert, slight spoiler alert, John the Fearless does never side with the English in the 1415 campaign. Okay, on to Wednesday, the 25th of September. The losses to the English army did not end with the fall of Harfleur. In fact, it seems likely that the majority of the casualties from the siege died after its capitulation. The end of September saw several prominent men expire. On this day, Sir John Chidiock, Lord Fitzpaine, succumbed. His is just one of the many names that do not appear noted in the chronicles as casualties of Henry's campaign. Those writing such works had no wish to commemorate anything but the glory of Henry's victory and the paucity of the English casualties. As a result, Many men who gave their lives for Henry were simply ignored. References to their death made for uncomfortable reading. Thursday the 26th. As noted several times already, Henry repeatedly followed the pattern of Edward III's Cressy campaign of 1346. Now he chose to enact another of Edward's wartime measures, a challenge to a duel. Edward III had first offered to fight a duel with his rival, King Philip of France, with the prize being the Kingdom of France, in 1340. The idea was that the king could parade his courage and his Christian virtues, offering to fight alone to avoid shedding Christian blood, while at the same time being very sure that his rival would not actually meet him in battle. Today he issued a challenge to the Dauphin to be carried to him at Vernon by the English herald William Bruges and Raoul de Gaucourt. And here again we get the actual words from the early 15th century. Brilliant stuff, which says, quote, Henry, by the grace of God, King of England and of France, and Lord of Ireland, to the high and pursuant prince, the Dauphin, our cousin, eldest son of the most pursuant prince, our cousin and adversary of France, from the reverence of God and to avoid the effusion of human blood, we have, in many times and in many ways, sought peace. And although we have not been able to obtain it, our desire to possess it increases more and more. And well considering that the effects of our wars are the deaths of men, destruction of countries, lamentations of women and children, and so many general evils, that every good Christian must lament it and have pity, and us especially, whom this matter particularly concerns, we are minded to seek diligently all possible means to avoid the above mentioned evils, and to acquire the approbation of God and the praise of the world. Whereas we have considered and reflected that, as it has pleased God to visit our said cousin and your father with infirmity, in us and you lies the remedy, and so everyone may know that we do not prevent it, we offer to place our quarrel at the will of God between our person and yours. And if it should appear to you that you cannot accept this offer on account of the interest that you think our said cousin, your father, has in it, we declare that if you are willing to accept it and to do what we propose, it pleases us to permit that our said cousin shall enjoy that which he has at present for the term of his life, out of reverence for God, and considering he, King Charles, is a sacred person, whatever it may please God to see happen between us and you, as it shall be agreed between his council, ours and yours. Thus, if God shall give us the victory, the crown of France with its appetencies shall be immediately rendered to us as our right, without difficulty, after his decease, and that all the lords and estates of the kingdom of France shall be bound to accept this, as shall be agreed between us. For it is better for us, cousin, to decide this war forever between our two persons, than to suffer the unbelievers, by means of our quarrels, to destroy Christianity, our mother, the Holy Church, to remain in division, and the people of God destroy one another. So a very roundabout way of saying, let's you and me finish this. You know, we don't want to kill other Christians unnecessarily. But as mentioned above, Henry knew the Dauphin would not accept, wouldn't accept the duel, or almost certainly wouldn't. Well, he didn't. Mortimer goes on. Here we see all the familiar arguments, that really all Henry wanted was peace, that he was simply doing God's will, and that the unification of England and France was desirable in the eyes of God, as it would help heal the schism in the church. Perhaps the most interesting line it contains is the overt statement that Henry sought the approbation of God and the praise of the world, which seems a neat summing up of what truly motivated him. Bruges and de Gaucourt were told to inform the Dauphin that Henry would wait for 8 days at Harfleur for the reply. The implication was that he would not wait much longer than that before leaving. And then, where would he go? Because as I said in the last episode, he's kind of got three choices. He could go back to England, because the siege of Harfleur just took much longer than it needed to, and he lost more men than he thought he would. So he could go back to England and wait for another year, or he could garrison Harfleur and wait for the French army to turn up, or he can chevaucher across northern France, Edward III style, to Calais, goading the French army. They're his three choices. The last one is what he did, and is sort of the most crazy option, especially seeing his men, loads of the army have got dysentery, if nothing else. Even if they didn't have dysentery, it'd still be the craziest option. But that's what he does decide to do. Mortimer continues. Sir William Butler of Warrington died today. He had been made a Knight of the Bath at Henry IV's coronation, alongside Henry V's three brothers. Thus, although he does not figure prominently in this book, he was a man whom the king had known for many years, and whose loss would have mattered to him personally. Henry ordered that Sir William's body should be dismembered and boiled, and sent back in the same ship that was carrying the bones of the Earl of Suffolk. There was also the matter of who was going to take charge of his retinue. Butler had led a party of 50 Lancashire archers to Harfleur, in addition to his own retinue of 4 men at arms and 12 archers. His death was a tragic blow to Henry, as well as a personal loss. Friday the 27th. Another night, Sir John Southworth died today, coming straight after the deaths of Sir John Chidiock and Sir William Butler. It causes us to ask how many Englishmen were sick at this point, and how many men had actually died or were dying. When Henry had landed on the 14th of August, he had had a minimum of 11,248 fighting men, of whom 2,266 were men at arms. In addition, there were the servants, pages, and support staff, resulting in at least 15,000 men with the king, excluding mariners. The long accepted method of assessing the proportion of sick men is based on the assumption that the whole army was equally infected, and all at the highest rate. This has normally been followed by historians in their keenness to justify the long-established figure of just 5,900 Englishmen at Agincourt, with the implication that the magnitude of the victory was as great as English legend and Henry V's propaganda claims. A less nationalistic and more considered approach, using the lists of those invalided back to England, allows us to establish an accurate minimum of 1,693 for those sent home. Unfortunately, these lists are incomplete, and we do not know how many names might be missing. However, as we know, the army was divided into 3 battles, or 3 army corps, you might say, under the command of the King, Clarence, and York. We can estimate casualty rates in all 3 areas where the English army was camped. This gives us a level of infection of about 17% across the whole army. That's massive. That's sort of disastrous level. The total number of men sent home was very probably between 1,693 and 2,550, of whom between 1,330 and 1,900 were fighting men, with the greatest concentration among the men situated in close proximity to the king. As for the number of deaths, there are actually very few deaths at Harfleur. One chronicler, Monstrelet, states that 2,000 Englishmen died at Harfleur, but it seems that, writing 30 years later, he confused 2,000 lost, i.e. invalided home, with 2,000 dead. A close examination of the surviving accounts shows there is only evidence for 37 English deaths, including those who died from attack as well as disease. Probably fewer than 50 Englishmen perished at Harfleur. To combat, that is. Raoul de Gaucourt was given leave to depart today, possibly in the company of William Bruges. But what was Henry to do with the other knights and men of honour who had surrendered at Harfleur? He decided to release them temporarily after they had sworn an oath to present themselves at Calais at Martinmas, which is the 11th of November. There they were to surrender themselves to the king himself or his lieutenant, or a specially appointed deputy. 60 knights, including de Gaucourt and more than 200 other gentlemen, were thus released in the expectation that they would voluntarily give themselves up into custody in just 6 weeks' time. If a battle had already taken place, he told them, they were simply to pay their ransoms. If no battle had taken place, they were to submit themselves to imprisonment. The people of Paris were in confusion. Some did not believe that Harfleur had yet fallen. Others thought that there must have been some betrayal, that it had been sold to the English. Others said that Henry had already admitted this publicly, and still more were in despair that the royal family was dealing with the war so badly. They bitterly resented the new taxation and openly sang songs in praise of the Duke of Burgundy. Around this time, a Frenchman called Colin de la Vallerie, one of the Burgundian faction who had been exiled from Paris, wrote a letter to his wife telling her to meet him at a certain town on the 20th of October and to bring with her 20 crowns, for John the Fearless was planning to be there by that time with a large army. Not having the money, she went to a friend to borrow it. Unfortunately, she left the letter with the said friend, who was an Armagnac supporter. In no time at all, the streets of Paris were seething with the news about an intended Burgundian rising. The gates were barricaded, and everyone in Paris was preparing for the city to be attacked, not by Henry V, but by John the Fearless. Saturday the 28th, which was the feast of Wenceslas, and we're told a great deal about St. Wenceslas, who was the patron saint of Bohemia, but I won't go into that because it's not strictly necessary to our story. We're told Henry's decision to send his sick back to England was forced upon him. To leave them at Harfleur would have been counterproductive in respect to both the likelihood of infecting others and their consumption of food and other resources. To take them with him on a march across France would have also been impossible. As the sick were returning without their horses and stores, they required relatively few ships. Perhaps 20 large vessels sufficed. The ships from Holland had returned to their own country shortly after the landing, and a number of English ships had returned to their ports on the 12th of September, but enough remained for the task. The sailing started today. The Earl of Arundel was put aboard a vessel with a guard of 5 healthy men-at-arms and many of his sick followers. One of his men-at-arms died in the process. Other important lords who were carried on board the ships included Thomas, Duke of Clarence, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, and John Mowbray, the Earl Marshal. Some of the biggest hitters in the army there. A significant proportion of the high-ranking lords who had undertaken to come to France had been lost. A total of 12 dukes and earls had mustered at Southampton in July. 2 earls were now dead, Suffolk and Cambridge. So with a further 3 earls and a duke lost to ill health, Henry had lost half of the original contingent of magnates. Furthermore, Henry had decided to leave his uncle, Thomas Beaufort, Earl of Dorset, in charge at Harfleur, and to send the Earl of Warwick directly to Calais by ship to defend the town and receive the prisoners. At a time when rank meant so much in terms of the structures of command, Henry was running out of leaders. Apart from Beaufort, there were only 4 members of the pre-campaign royal council with him: his youngest brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the Duke of York, Lord Fitzhugh, and Sir Thomas Erpingham. End quote. So this chevauchee Henry's about to do is going to be done on a shoestring with a skeleton crew, sort of the absolute bare minimum. It must have seemed foolhardy at the time. It must have seemed a bit crazy. But hey, we all know how it turned out, so let's continue. Sunday the 29th, which was Michaelmas. In England, the Regent John, Duke of Bedford, sent out a writ to all the sheriffs, prelates, and lords proroguing Parliament from the 21st of October to the 4th of November. He had received a message from Henry, who seems to have expressed a desire to be present at the said Parliament. Henry had allowed himself 5 weeks to make the journey back to Westminster. What was his strategy at this juncture? He had appointed his uncle, Thomas Beaufort, lieutenant at Harfleur, but clearly he did not intend to stay there to command personally. This accords with the information about his intended march through Montivilliers, Dieppe, Rouen, and Paris, mentioned in Bourdieu's letter of the 3rd of September. It also tallies with his letter to the Dauphin, challenging him to a duel, which stated that he was going to stay at Harfleur for 8 days, implying that he was going to leave shortly afterwards. Clearly, he never intended in wintering in the town, but was planning to march through France. But where was he heading? Rouen and Paris, as Bourdieu stated, or Calais? As we have seen, and as Henry knew, the French army was gathering in Rouen. To attack it would be risking disaster. English longbow armies were most successful when they managed to force an enemy to attack them, and they themselves were in a static position. Then they cut down the troops charging towards them, using the first fallen ranks as a means to slow up the ranks behind while they shot at them. Henry might have gone looking for a fight and tried to attract the French to attack him near Rouen, but, had he done so, he would have had no escape plan, being so deep within Normandy. If the French failed to be drawn into the attack, they could slowly strangle his army by withholding supplies, besieging the English in the field, as it were, and they could call up more and more men, the French could. Henry could not call up reinforcements, thus there was a good strategic reason why he was not intending to head to Rouen. This part of Bourdieu's letter was probably deliberate misinformation in case it fell into French hands. By the time it arrived in Bordeaux, it would not have mattered what it said about Henry's strategy. Calais, on the other hand, did offer an escape route, for it was a port. Henry had been fortifying and provisioning the town all year for this very reason. For his troops to embark anywhere else, he would have needed to arrange for a fleet to go to that place and wait there in fear of being attacked. He would then have to lead his men to the waiting ships and make sure that they all embarked without being attacked by a following French army. Disembarking had taken 3 whole days before. It was a risky operation. Thus Calais was his only realistic option. It was his only safe port of embarkation. All the English held alternatives were in Gascony, hundreds of miles to the south. In addition, de Gaucourt, de Estreville, and the other French prisoners from Harfleur had been instructed to make their way to Calais and to surrender there to Henry in person, or, if he was not there, if he had already departed for England, for example, then a specially appointed deputy. This deputy would probably have been someone of high status, probably the Earl of Warwick, the lieutenant of Calais, who was sent directly there by ship. There is no doubt that Henry was sticking steadfastly to the plan to march to Calais that had been developed many months earlier. Although it seems clear that marching to Calais was, and always had been, his intended strategy, we have to ask whether this destination was chosen in order to attract the attention of the French army gathering at Rouen. In short, did he intend to do battle? Answering this question is a developmental process. As Henry proceeded towards Calais, he could have expected his circumstances to change. So it is worth attempting to answer this difficult question at various stages, including the outset, to see whether the answer changed as the march altered course and ran into difficulties. So Henry's decision-making process would have to change on the hoof, so to speak. The answer at this initial juncture is yes, he did intend to fight the French. There are several reasons for this conclusion. First, Henry wanted a battle because his religious outlook demanded it. He had come to France to put God's will to the test, and that could only properly be done by a conflict in which he might lose his life. Second, he had come with an army that was too large for just a siege. It was an army designed to fight a pitched battle. Although he had lost many men, he still had the majority and so could stick to his original plan. Third, he was determined to follow a path previously trodden by Edward III's army to Blanchecreux, a point at which the River Somme could be forded. Henry III's march, which culminated in the Battle of Crécy, had been chosen specifically to encourage the French to attack the English in Ponthieu. Henry, having sent Raoul de Gaucourt with William Bruges to deliver the challenges to the Dauphin, knew that the Dauphin would have learnt from de Gaucourt that the English were marching to Calais. He had even told him roughly the time he was going to depart, after 8 days. Telling all 260 gentlemen prisoners to meet him in Calais was similarly a guarantee that the French would know where he was going. He was thus encouraging the French to come after him and attack him. In his instructions to the 260 prisoners, he even referred overtly to the likelihood of a battle. Thus, he was not just following Edward III's route, he was adopting similar tactics. A fourth reason can be seen in the personal nature of Henry's decision to march to Calais. It is clear from several sources that the majority of the leaders still within the army at this point were strongly opposed to the idea of the march, precisely because a battle would be too dangerous. One source claims that even the warlike Duke of Clarence was in favour of bringing the campaign to an end, a division with Henry that perhaps led to his departure from the English army as much as his suffering from dysentery. Leaving this aside, another well-informed chronicler, writing sometime after 1446, so, decades later, stated that the majority of the councillors were of the opinion that a decision should be made not to march on, due to the shortage of fighting men following the ravages of dysentery. The author of the Gesta wrote very much the same thing, and here's a quote from the history of the time. Although a large majority of the Royal Council advised against such a proposal, as it would be highly dangerous for him in this way to send his small force, daily growing smaller, against the multitude of the French, which, constantly growing, would surely enclose them on every side like sheep in folds, our king, relying on divine grace and the justice of his cause, piously reflecting that victory consists not in a multitude, but with him meaning God, who bestows victory upon whom he wills, whether they be of the many or the few, with God affording him his leadership, as it is believed, did nevertheless decide to make that march. End quote. As I said in the last one, it just seems Henry had made his mind up. He'd gambled everything on this campaign, and he needed a decisive victory. Just going home having taken Harfleur, and Harfleur only, just wasn't good enough. He needed a pitched battle and a victory, a decisive one. And so even if it means doing this chevauchée across northern France and goading the French, a much bigger army, which is extremely dangerous, and most military minds at the time and since have thought it was sort of crazily dangerous, he feels like he's got to do it anyway. He's already gambled. He feels like he's already made the gamble. So now he's got to actually go through with it and do it. Okay, Mortimer continues saying, the latter source gives a similar justification for the decision, stating that Henry said he would rather throw himself and his men on the mercy of God in determining the outcome of events, not shirking the dangers, than offer himself to the enemy as grounds for elevating their pride, diminishing the reputation of his honour by flight. From these accounts, it is clear that Henry went against the consensus and took what his councillors considered to be a great gamble, deliberately risking a battle. This contrasts with his considerable aversion to taking any risks in the course of landing in August. What made him switch from being so risk-averse then to being so risk-taking now? It could only have been a defiance of the very risk that so worried his council, a chance to do battle. Thus, his decision to march to Calais was not just a testing of God's will, and it was not just a strategic calculation based on Edward III's success in 1346. It was also a matter of pride. The above motivations, religious fanaticism, a confident strategy based on a historical precedent, and pride, are not particularly edifying, Looking at Henry at the end of September, one would hardly call him a great man. He had obtained one small town, a key target, but had destroyed it in the process. He had lost a good proportion of his fighting force and left the remainder perilously situated in a hostile kingdom with a large army gathering in the field. As far as any reckoning of God's judgment went at the moment, his cause had been cast into doubt by the death of Bishop Courtenay and the sickness of his brother and heir, Thomas, and his great friend, the Earl of Arundel. The descent revealed by the Earl of Cambridge's plot had not added to his glory, nor had the continued activities of the Lollards, at home, that is. Yet it was at this moment that he stepped out from the clouds of fallibility and made the decision that made him, and changed him, and altered the balance of European politics in England's favour. Through it, he set himself on the path to acquire the approbation of God and the praise of the world. If Henry had shown any sign of greatness up until this point, it was as an organiser and a man convinced of his own infallibility, arranging for the circumstances of this march to be as promising as possible. But in going against the council's decision, now he showed that he was far more than just an organiser and a facilitator. It must have taken complete determination, after all the delays and after losing so many men to dysentery, to give the order to march on, and in so doing he took on all the responsibility and all the danger. He knew that he was himself a far greater prize than the ruins of Harfleur. He knew the French would think they could retake the town any time, and so they were bound to come after him. Then Henry and his army would lead the enemy away from the near defenceless Harfleur, like a lioness leading a predator away from her cubs. At this moment in time, we can see Henry V throwing everything behind his faith. This is the moment when, having mapped out a path to greatness, he actually set foot on it. Like Jan Hus, he was prepared to die in pursuit of what he believed he had to do. Historians have sometimes called this the madness of unreasoning pietism, but they forget that if a man truly believes God is on his side, no reasoning is necessary, or even possible. For him, God really is on his side, and it would be madness to pretend otherwise. That is what is so frightening about Henry V at the end of September 1415. End quote. Just a complete confidence that you're in the right and that God will see you through. We hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, please head over to lotuseaters.com for the full unabridged video.